I think it's a really timely salon that we have today. Jeff Ladish, actually, I think it was last year, he gave a fantastic salon with Dave Denkenberger from Alfred on civilizational collapse scenarios. And, you know, back then, any scenario of this caliber was still kind of like this, like hypothetical, kind of like catastrophic scenario. And, you know, we were kind of scolding us for being all doomy on that day. But, you know, here we are really really just a year later. I think it was a year ago. And yeah, I just got reminded of how different the world was back then, and the situation that we're currently in. That said, I also think it's been really quite a hopeful and fantastic time, because I think a lot of people are kind of like jumping into action. I think it's really great that a lot of people actually have the kind of freedom to, you know, not pivot everything that we're doing to just like kind of like join the COVID heckmeck, but to actually try to think, what are my comparative advantages? How can I bring them to solve this crisis? And how can I actually kind of like create something out of this that may even usher into a better world afterwards than before the fact? And so I'm super excited to have kind of like two like role models of this kind really here today, Tessa and Jeff, both of which I'm insanely honored to call amongst our fellows this year. It's really an honor on our end. I think you've both done really just incredible work, kind of like across the board. I'll share a little bit more about both of your bios in here, and then maybe link to your fellow page. But yeah, I'm really quite honored to have you both on board at Foresight. I can't wait for what you're going to be presenting on today. Today we're wow, big bug. Today we're going to focus on mastering the dance, and I'll share like a related article on that as well in the chat notes if people want to follow up. But we're basically going to talk about, okay, how can we actually reboot society with testing and tracing? So first we're going to, I think, talk a little bit about what's the problem here, and then what are both of those technologies? How can we use them well? What are perhaps issues around privacy and so on? And how can we kind of like navigate the waters in a beneficial way? So I think this is really quite kind of like quite fresh from the oven research that is currently actively being pursued. A lot of projects in that area are kind of like actively up and running. Yeah, I cannot wait for what you're both going to discuss. I think Jeffrey is going to kick us off more generally and on contact tracing, and then I think Tessa is going to get into the nitty gritties, as I've already seen in your slides. So anyway, I don't want to take away any further from your time. I'm going to share a little bit more about the salons here in the chat. And more people are still joining the waiting room, which I'm going to admit bit by bit. But yeah, I would say we give Jeff, then Tessa first the stage for a little bit, unless you have clarifying questions, in which case I think maybe if they're relevant to a slide or so, then feel free to ask them right away. But we want to definitely leave some time for discussion afterwards. And yeah, without further ado, Jeff, if you want to kick us off in about mastering the dance, I can't wait for your presentation. Welcome.
Great, thanks, Allison. Really appreciate it. Yeah, so the past few months, I've been working on sort of trying to research in-depth test and trace strategy, and then sort of working in an advisory role with a bunch of different organizations, some nonprofits, working with a couple state and local governments, and sort of various researchers around the world. So a lot of what I'm going to say right now is not my work, but sort of work that I've been able to gather together from a lot of different sources. So appreciate all of the work that people have been putting into that, and I will sort of call out some particular people and groups as I go. So let me start with the problem. I think the problem is a bit obvious to all of us at this point, as we are sort of sheltering in place in our various places around the world. But you know, there's currently a thing that we need, which is that we need the reproduction number of this virus, which I think at this point people have probably all heard of, to go below 1, right? So when this number is below 1, this means that the spread of the virus will basically exponentially decay. When it's above 1, it will exponentially spread. So there are a lot of different ways to sort of try to reduce this number, right? Often referred to as non-pharmaceutical interventions. And so the one I'm going to talk about is testing and tracing. But there's a lot of other things that we can do as well. So the one that we're all doing right now is sheltering in place, right? So as we are sheltering in place, a lot less contact between different people, and so naturally the virus spreads less well. Unfortunately, if we lift up and ease shelter in place right now in the United States, absent sort of other things that we're doing, we're just going to see this virus spread a ton more, and we're going to see big outbreaks. And actually, sort of, I'll register a prediction here. I think this is likely to happen. I think some states are going to open early within the next few weeks, probably, at least in partial ways. And I think that we're going to see the infection rates there skyrocket pretty quickly. The argument that I'm making is, unless we have a really solid test and trace policy in place, we won't be able to reopen without seeing a massive spike in infections. And I'll say a bit of what I think that this sort of, what would be adequate to do this. But where I'll start is by looking at the countries that have successfully been able to do this. So unfortunately, it's very hard to run sort of randomized trials on the level of populations of thousands of people. We can't really do that. But what we can see is we can look at countries that have done something successful already or something partially successful, and we can see how well did that actually work. And so, yeah, so let me start with some. South Korea, Taiwan, and Hong Kong, and China have all done a pretty great job managing to contain the virus and contain its spread. So one way that they were able to do this was by just having a massive number of tests. I think it's a little tricky right now because when people talk about testing numbers, they talk about a number of different metrics, and these metrics mean pretty different things. One of them is sort of tests per capita, like how many tests do you have per person? And this is sort of a useful metric for looking at, well, what is your coverage of the entire population? But it's a bit tricky because it doesn't actually tell you something pretty useful, which another metric does cover. And this metric is, what are the percentages of cases of tests that come back positive? And this number is a bit more useful because it tells you how many cases that you're likely missing. So all of the countries that have so far successfully managed to contain the spread of the virus and get those numbers down have had a positive test percentage of less than 4%. So if you look at South Korea, if you look at Taiwan, you look at Hong Kong, and you look at the total fraction of their tests coming back positive, it's less than 4%. The US is currently at around 20%, as is sort of a lot of European states as well. And this suggests that we're just missing a large portion of cases with our testing. And so at this sort of very basic disease surveillance level, we can just tell that our testing isn't there yet. So for a test and trace strategy to work, you need two things. One, you need this really large number of tests that are targeted at sort of the right people, the people most likely to be infected. And the other thing you need is the ability to contact all of the people who have tests that have come back positive. And you need to make sure that you can learn who those people have come in contact with. And so the traditional way of doing this is with a lot of phone calls. You have a lot of people, I think someone has their mic not muted, but you need a lot of people to just get on the phone and call up those people and say, hey, in the last 24 to 48 hours, who did you come in contact with for longer than 15 minutes where you were closer than 2 meters apart? And you get all of their contact information and you call each and every one of those people and you ask them to self-isolate. And then you have follow-up calls. You say, every day you call them up and you say, hey, how are you doing? Do you have any symptoms? Do you need to isolate? And optionally, but if you have the test capacity to do it, you can then get those people tested. So now you're starting to sort of map out a network of who might be infected and testing every case that you come across. So those are like the two main things you need in place in order for this strategy to work. Now, one way that, one thing that you need in order for a strategy like this to work is you need to hire a massive number of contact tracers to do this as their job. But there's a lot of different methods that you can use sort of beyond that. What Tessa is going to talk about later is sort of how you might be able to use apps to help with this process. But another thing that countries are doing, in particular South Korea, is that they are using a lot of different data sources in order to do this. And this is very controversial. So they are, for example, getting the GPS data of everyone who's been infected. They're getting the credit card transaction data of everyone who's been infected. And they're using this data to triangulate where those people have been and who they've talked to. Now, this would be totally illegal in the United States, but it's not illegal in South Korea because after their SARS and MERS experience, they passed some pretty permissive laws that enabled them to get this data. Taiwan requires you to, once you have been sort of tagged as a suspected case, you have to download an app that basically tracks your location and it puts a geofence around you. And if you leave that space, then someone contacts you. And if your phone dies, someone knocks on your door at 3 a.m. in the morning and says, "Hey, where did you go? What's up?" So Hong Kong also has something very similar to that. So I think it's pretty obvious to most of us here or I think it's obvious to me that this would be a huge government overreach if the US were to try to implement something similar. So I'm not recommending that we do this, but what I am trying to say is for all of the countries that have succeeded at containing the virus, they've had to do pretty drastic things. It's not only that they've had a really large number of tests and hired a very large number of people, they've also used these like pretty invasive measures to gather data about people. And I think the reason why it's useful to note that is it sort of suggests what the threshold difficulty level is for being able to execute a successful contact tracing strategy, test and trace strategy. And so I think that we can absolutely do it without those invasive privacy measures, but we need to be realistic about how many resources we're going to have to throw at the problem. And the claim I'm making is that currently we are not on track to spend anywhere near the number of resources that will be required in order to manage containment. Well, with a bit of a caveat. I mean, the federal government of the United States has not yet pledged anywhere near the number of resources necessary. I actually found out today that the state of California has planned to hire 10,000 contact tracers, which, as I'll talk about in a second, is actually totally the right order of magnitude. So individual states, I think, are beginning to be on track, and the federal government really hasn't caught up yet. So where are we right now? Well, the US per day is testing about 150,000 people. The number of tests coming back positive, as I mentioned before, is around 20%. And I don't know exactly how many contact tracers have been hired in the United States right now, but I'm guessing it's between about 500 and 5,000. Okay, well, how does this relate to where I think we need to be? There's a lot of complex arguments about exactly how many tests you need, per capita or per case. And there's a lot of these questions about, well, exactly how many contact tracers do you need per case, or do you need, per capita? I'm not going to go into sort of the complicated arguments behind those things, but I will point towards a couple of great, I think, policy documents that have made really good arguments for that. One of them is the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security, which is a really great organization. They've put out a report a week ago, and the report calls for hiring about 100,000 contact tracers in the United States, which would cost approximately, I think, $3.5 billion, which is a small fraction of the stimulus money, I would point out. So that's their recommendation. I've sort of looked at those numbers and looked at their arguments. I think that's pretty solid. So we need to be at approximately 100,000. We're at maybe a couple thousand. Unfortunately, the situation with testing is even worse. So another report, actually, this is one that Allison was just sharing with me recently, that came out of Harvard. It's called, what is it called? A Roadmap to Pandemic Resilience. And I'll share this in the chat after this. It's a really excellent sort of high-level strategic overview of what we need to do. Basically covers a lot of the things I'm talking about right now. Their estimate is that by June, we need to have 5 million tests per day. Now, we are at 150,000 tests per day right now. And so we have a long ways to go there. So I think the good news here is that for contact tracing, this is something that states can scale up pretty quickly. There's currently a lot of people who need work right now. So in terms of like, is there a big employee base? Like, yes, there absolutely is. There are a lot of people who are doing customer service jobs or other sorts of jobs in that same sector who really could use work right now. So I think there's a huge resource base right there to tap into, and you could give a lot of those people jobs, and it would be a real win-win situation. And this is something that state and local authorities can do right now. So there are some states that will need sort of additional federal assistance for this in terms of financial resources, but there's not that much that the federal government needs to do outside of just make these resources available. And there are some states that are already on the path to this. California, I mentioned. Massachusetts also has a plan to hire about 1,000 contact tracers, which is still like only 50% of sort of what Johns Hopkins recommends. But that's actually a pretty good start. So there are some states that are taking the lead here. I expect in the next few weeks or next week or so, more states will take the lead, but this is something that where federal funding would really help with. Unfortunately, the testing side is a lot more dire right now. I said that we were at 150,000 tests per day, but what that number doesn't show is the growth over time. And right now, if you look at the last 2 or 3 weeks, we've seen about consistently 150,000 tests per day that entire time, as in that number is not growing right now. What that means is that we're not expanding test capacity at all. And this is a huge problem, because if we're going to get up to 2 million per day or 5 million per day, or even 20 million per day, hopefully by August, we're going to have to sort of radically increase the number of tests that we can make. I think the only way we're likely to be able to do this is at the federal level. This Harvard report recommends making a sort of testing board, a national testing board, similar to sort of the War Production Board in World War II, that would give the federal government the authority to basically work at every level of the supply chain to make sure that there are enough resources to get this thing, to build the infrastructure necessary to making this thing happen. This is a case where the market's not going to solve this, because it's really expensive to put in that infrastructure to expand testing capacity that much. And currently there's not demand for it. So even though that we know at the national level we need that many tests, that doesn't mean that hospitals can afford that many tests. So the money has to come from somewhere, and there has to be a guarantee that there will actually be a buyer for those things. And this is a big commons problem, right? Like, even though individual companies would love to have tests right now, there's just no guarantee that that market exists without the federal government sort of stepping in and saying, no, it definitely does, and we are going to make it happen. So I'd say in terms of what the US's #1 priority right now, it should be that. And so far, the federal government just hasn't made moves to do that yet, and that's the thing that I think really needs to happen. Oh, by the way, that Peter Eckersley gave a talk on Foresight Salon, I think, a few weeks ago, and he was also involved in that report, which is awesome, and Glenn Weil was as well. And yeah, there's a lot of additional pieces about testing, sort of what the particular bottlenecks are, reagents, and things like that, and it's all very interesting and complex. But my claim here is that this is the kind of thing that all of those problems are solvable. They just require some serious dedicated effort and money to solve. And I think that's what we need. So the last piece I want to get into in terms of what would really make our strategy successful here is about incentives and around isolation and notification. So I think people understandably in the United States are very skeptical of government interventions, especially when they're heavy-handed. And so I think, right now, a lot of people are economically hurting, and people's physical health is suffering, people's mental health is suffering. So in order for the federal government and state governments to successfully implement something that's at as large scale as test and trace, it's super important that they win over the trust of the people that they are trying to work with. And so if you're asking people to, not go to work for, a month because they need to isolate because they've been potentially exposed, you need to compensate people. You need to make sure that those people, not only have food and basic resources, but also that they have some sort of financial compensation. What you really don't want is a case where people are like, oh, I've been exposed, but I need to hide the fact that I've been exposed because I don't trust that I'll be looked out for if I need to isolate. I can't afford that. So it's not just that this is the right thing to do, although it obviously is the right thing to do. It's also that it's a vital part of the strategy. There's other situations where, people will be in nursing homes, people will be in group homes, people will be in intergenerational housing, like a lot of immigrants are in that situation. And those people need to be able to isolate somewhere outside of their home. And they're understandably going to have a lot of difficulty, being separated from their family. So I think it's very important that that's voluntary, and also that sort of they are incentivized to do that with the resources that they need. So yeah, that's the high level of where I think we are and where I think we need to go right now.
All right, thank you so much. I think yeah, you get some muted claps right there. Okay, well, I think we will jump right into Tessa's talk, and then we're going to do a longer discussion at the end of it. But this was a fantastic overview. I think you really brought people up to speed and made some pretty actionable claims here. Tessa, take it away.
All right. Give me some indication that I'm successfully sharing my screen. Great. Yeah, so as Jeff mentioned, Peter Eckersley gave a talk almost a month ago now about privacy preserving contact tracing and using phones to do that. And I thought, since I've been working on one of those projects, I thought it might be nice to give an update on some of the evolving privacy concerns and the progress that's been made in the past month. So what you're seeing on this slide is just a GIF showing that kind of process of transmission chains where, you know, you'll be pre-symptomatically infectious, and it's pretty hard to trace down exactly who might have infected who did you see in a given day. So that's sort of my first point, is like, why bother at all with technology-assisted contact tracing? Like, it's true that the sort of traditional contact tracing of phoning people and doing interviews, it works. It is a proven technology. So why bother with this kind of phone apps approach at all? And in short, it's just that you can get a similar reduction in the spread for maybe having to hire fewer contact tracers. And that's because interviews are really hard. So one of the kinds of technology assistance for contact tracing is just creating apps that let you structure the data that comes out of your interviews more closely. And that's, you know, that feels maybe less technologically exciting, but I think that's very important, and that's what some people are focusing their efforts on. And I think that's really valuable. The other reason is that memory is fallible, and so you can get some benefits from jogging people's memory using the kind of location information that you can get from a phone. So, you know, even in cases where you're not asking someone to install an app or share anything, what we'll be seeing with the kind of contact tracers who California is hiring is they'll be asking the people who they're on the phone with, hey, could you look at Google Maps and see where you went? Or, you know, if you use Strava or any of those other apps that people might already be using to track their locations, these interviewers won't necessarily be asking for that information, but they'll be asking people to use that to jog their memories. And we also know that this kind of thing has helped with other epidemics. So this is a picture of a contact tracer working in Sierra Leone during the Ebola epidemic there. And there was a fair bit of success using what I'm calling here boring and useful technology-assisted contact tracing. So this is the piece of software that actually San Francisco is adopting. It's called Demagi, and it basically is just a super simple medical app building tool. And so San Francisco is planning to use this to build an app to help their contact tracers. And again, it's not necessarily adding more information, it's really just structuring interviews. And Jeffrey already said this really clearly, so, you know, I'll just say briefly, contact tracing is just one part of test, trace, and isolate. You know, it's not nearly as useful if we can't test someone who we know has been exposed, even if we have this really good method of tracking who's been exposed. If someone doesn't have a place to self-isolate, you know, if someone's homeless and they don't have a place to go, then even if you can perfectly identify that they have been exposed, they can't necessarily take any action based on that. Similarly, can they afford to self-isolate? You know, there's one of the things that, again, San Francisco is planning to do is check in with people, hey, you know, do you have 2 weeks of food? Do you need the health department to deliver you some food? Which I think is really wise, and is also not a thing that every country is going to be able to do. You know, we, in the US, there has maybe a lack of organizational leadership, but there are a lot of resources for supporting people like that. And I think this kind of approach will be much less possible in places where, you know, the government can't deliver you quarantine food. Okay, that aside, like how can we do this sort of maybe less boring, but also useful form of technology-assisted contact tracing where you're using your phone? So there are a bunch of like really exciting kinds of data that can assist with that kind, you know, less fallible than memory approach to contact tracing. So I already mentioned structured interviews, but you can also use how your phone is, like which cell phone network towers your phone is connecting to track your location. People also have their GPS turned on quite often. One of the things that I know more about, because the app that I've been working on uses it, is Bluetooth proximity sensing. So that's just, you know, if you are near another phone and you're communicating in an interoperable way, you can tell how far away you are by the Bluetooth signal strength. You can do similar things with Wi-Fi. And then maybe the sort of most decentralized thing is, you know, some places have just set up QR codes of, you know, you scan when you walk into this restaurant or something, or, you know, super, super decentralized apps where you just scan a code on each other's phone. So there's all these kinds of data that can give you more information about who you might have been close to, where you might have been, and therefore who, if you become diagnosed with COVID-19, you might have exposed. And there's a lot of surveillance concerns with this. So Jeff talked about a few of these, but South Korea is one of the countries we talk about often as having been really successful at containing the spread of COVID-19. But I think I'm opening with them because the South Korean government has massive powers to do warrantless seizure of people's data. And that's actually because of some laws passed in the aftermath of the outbreak of MERS, or Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, a couple of years ago. And so the government the government passed some laws which allowed it to seize people's private data without any kind of warrant. Where have you been? Just kind of arbitrary amounts of your personal data. And so I think that's an example that gives people pretty reasonable concerns of, if we start allowing governments to access this data because of an epidemic, that access isn't going to go away. It certainly didn't in South Korea. And now you see, I can't read Korean, so I can't read these tweets, or these texts rather, but I've heard that the emergency alerts going out are things like, a 51-year-old man was in this restaurant at this time, and then he went to this other place. And that's very, very actionable. It's useful for people to know, but it's also incredibly personal information. I heard about one which was like, yes, this, 43-year-old man went to a sexual harassment seminar in this city on this day. And I'm like, maybe the government shouldn't be able to send that out broadly. Maybe that shouldn't be allowed.
They were probably the ones who were requiring him to go to the seminar, but anyway.
Yeah. And then, surveillance concerns, by example, Israel. So I will say that the Israeli parliament today nixed this, the surveillance that was happening. I use this image just because this is from a James Mickens paper that I think is very funny of, if Mossad wants to read your data, they're going to. This is, of course, not Mossad, but Shin Bet, because it's internal and external. But regardless, Israel was just seizing people's location data, also warrantless, also, with some vague claims of, we'll just do it temporarily. We're only taking on these powers for 30 days. And the parliament today was like, no, that's just not, no. You would at least need parliament's permission to do that. So I mean, on some level good, but this kind of thing is what has been raising concerns. And then Jeff talked a little bit about this kind of digital fencing or geofencing that's been done in Hong Kong and Taiwan. So in Hong Kong, you get off a plane there and they strap a tracking bracelet to your wrist. And you're also obligated to install an app on your phone. And then when you arrive to wherever you're going to quarantine for 14 days, you activate the app and sort of can walk around your apartment. And that determines the space of where you're allowed to be in Hong Kong for the next 14 days. And the police will come and possibly fine you very large amounts of money if they're not receiving signals from your phone confirming that you are there. Similarly, in Taiwan, the police will phone you every couple of days to make sure that you are have your phone on and with you. So you can't just leave your phone on in your apartment and go elsewhere. And Taiwan is using not your phone's GPS data and an app. They're basically saying your phone has to be connected to one specific cell network tower. And if the kind of national cell phone carriers detect your phone connecting to a different cell phone network tower, you will get in trouble. Anyway, so all this is just to say there's all these really exciting data sources that can come from your phone. And there are a lot of really reasonable surveillance concerns about the kinds of technology-assisted contact tracing and sort of digital fencing, geofencing, et cetera, that's being implemented right now. So then there's the question of, is it possible to preserve privacy while getting some of the advantages of technology-assisted contact tracing? And a number of groups have put out reports recently outlining various principles for this. I'm not going to go into detail about them, but I can link those reports in the chat if that would be useful. But I wanted to go through a couple of different models of how more privacy-preserving approaches have been implemented. So the first one I wanted to talk about is Trace Together, which was probably the first Bluetooth-based contact tracing app that was released broadly. This is in Singapore. It was built by the Singapore government. And the way it works is, I say it's semi-voluntary because you don't have to install the app. But if you do, then it will use your phone as a Bluetooth beacon, try to communicate with other phones in the surrounding area. that also have TraceTogether installed, which means that you can, again, get these proximity measurements when you're near to somebody. And I say it's semi-voluntary because although you're not obligated to install the app, you are obligated to turn over your data if you get a positive diagnosis and are communicating with the contact tracers at the health agency. Which again, you know, TraceTogether is like, this isn't required, but this is appropriate for Singapore. And I think, and that may well be, I do think people accept a lot more. I think things that might be seen as an overstep in a North American context are acceptable to people in Singapore. And I say it's semi-centralized because by default, all of your logs of proximity of, hey, you were near this phone, this other phone at this time, are just stored locally on your phone. But if you are obligated to hand over your data, it goes into the centralized database, and the contact tracers can link that to who is being exposed and send those people notifications directly and also phone them. So there's the centralized database that you don't by default put your information into, but except for your phone number and an ID, so your sort of logs of proximity aren't in there. But when proximity logs are uploaded, they are connected to your ID. So if you've been exposed, that's not private from the health system. And then I want to talk about a voluntary decentralized model with data sharing. So this is SafePaths, which is an app that's been built by a team at MIT that has done a lot of work on anonymizing GPS data. And I will be honest that some of their cryptography approaches are a bit over my head. But basically they say, you know, you don't have to install the app. Everything stays local. But if you choose to upload your data, then that anonymized data will also be aggregated and shared with health departments. So it shouldn't be leaking any individual identity ideally, but also GPS data is very, very hard to anonymize. Yeah, I guess I'd say it's sort of in between in that way. And then the other model I want to talk about is decentralized model with limited data sharing. So this is where you're using, again, Bluetooth proximity tracking rather than GPS. And it's all stored locally unless you choose to upload, and the identities of people can't be inferred from the central database that's being used to send alerts to folks. So this is there are a lot of different projects in this area, and I'm happy to talk about them in more detail. Perhaps one of the most important things here is that Apple and Google have released a specification for this and are planning to release an API that will work nicely with the Android and iOS operating systems, and will also enable this kind of Bluetooth peer-to-peer proximity tracing, which I think is kind of cool. Big question for all of this. Will people use the voluntary app enough for it to work? Only maybe. So Singapore, again, with TraceTogether, was the first place where it was installed, and it has been adopted by, last I checked, around 12% of the population, which on some level, that's a lot of people to install an app. On another level, it's not enough at all. So there is one study out of the University of Oxford that said that 56% is the rate of install that you would want to target. So 12% is very short of that. So, you know, some of those maybe less, some of those less decentralized models can still assist with traditional contact tracing. And even these sort of like basic proximity alerts can, you know, can be at all useful, but I think in terms of this technology alone, being able to bend the curve, you really have to have a very high percentage of people install it. And I think this is why people have been excited about the Android and iOS specification, is that there's some possibility, not that people will be required to use it, but that you will be able to have all of the various large groups of people who have been developing these kinds of apps to develop something that's interoperable, if everyone agrees to use that specification, which might kind of increase the percentage of folks who have something like this installed. And then I just wanted to do a brief aside to you know, I do really think it's important to work on privacy preserving contact tracing if we're going to do this technology assisted contact tracing. Some of, you know, the privacy implications of some of these designs really worry me. And there's a lot of people's location data that has been put out there already. So this is actually something from Foursquare of sort of aggregated anonymized-ish visit data to all of their locations. Showing, oh wow, people sure are going out less in California, which makes sense because we're under shelter in place. And some of you may have seen this tweet of people being like, oh, you know, want to see the potential impact of ignoring social distancing? Here's this heat map of people leaving beaches in Florida. I was like, okay, I'm sure that sort of legally all of those people opted in to sharing their location, but do they know that they have, and that it's possible to make heat maps of where they've gone? I'm not sure that they do. So I guess just to conclude, I'm hoping that we broadly being everyone working on technology assisted contact tracing is able to converge on a privacy preserving approach that's also interoperable. And I think this needs to be in a context of testing and tracing and isolating that makes the technology assistance useful. I think it's just one part of this larger picture. And I will now stop sharing my screen so we can discuss.
Amazing. This was awesome. Okay. Thank you so much, Tessa and Jeff. I would say we open it up to questions from the audience. If you'd like, you can, well, let's see how we're going to do this. How about if you have a question, say so in the chat now, or raise your hand via the feature, or raise your hand on the video, because many of you actually have your video on. Anyone with a question? Brad, over there, you go first. You are muted.
I'm trying to unmute there. Does that sound better? All right.
Yeah, that's great.
So there have been some criticisms even of the Bluetooth pair logging, because if a person publishes that they are infected and they publish their pairs, it could be traced back to them or places they've been. So I was trying to solve that. Has anyone considered the reverse, which is an immensely greater amount of data, which is each Bluetooth interaction involves generating a common shared secret known to no one else. And then you publish everyone's pairs, so that there's just a big sea of pairs, but then later if someone is revealed, then they can find the people they came in contact with by publishing the shared secrets, and those people would say, oh, that's my shared secret. So could we get past that privacy problem that way?
I'm a little confused. It seems like it would expose more data. So currently there is a shared secret that's exchanged. Well, yeah,
I guess it's not shared, but most of the models involve rotating these kind of randomized keys every Poisson distribution time intervals. So
right, and so you publish the generation key so that someone. This is just to shrink the data, and I think we may be foolishly trying to shrink the data, because by publishing these keys we are creating some risk. If you just have lots of collections of random numbers, there's nothing you can really see from lots of collections of random numbers. The trick is to make it so that only the phones know, even after the keys are revealed, only the phones know what it means. And so someone who was logging everything that went on in their mall would still not be able to know anything. That's my goal.
Yeah, and I think it's the case that the
I think the main limitation right now that I've seen is about data size. So there's also a problem, which is the more data that you want to send to each phone size is a bit technical. The more everyone has to download, and so I think at the point that Brad, if you did that for if you did that for literally everyone, now you're talking about hundreds of millions of people, even in the United States, and at that point your data is probably going to get into the gigabyte range.
Well, I had I'll have to write it down, but I had some ways to obviously avoid that. Yes, you're not. Yeah, actually, though, gigabytes are not that big a deal anymore.
But on mobile data, it's just still a bit hard. But
I mean, it's one episode of Tiger King. It's really not.
Sure, totally. What I'd say is we'd be happy to connect you with you may already be in touch with the people who are working on this on the COVID Watch side of things, because I think they would love your feedback on that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
All right, Alistair, you had a comment.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tessa and Jeff. That was brilliant. I I guess my one question is, if we wanted to give Apple and Android, Apple and Google, ubiquitous maximal power to do a contact tracing app, has anyone seen any strong arguments or thorough research or even any framework or anything for how there might be a sunset clause in those powers and how they might be able to be rolled back? Because I've been reading Surveillance Capitalism, and it seems, you know, anathema to the way it all works, but it's sometimes a portion of the discussion.
So at least the specification that Apple, Google put out so far does say, you know, this is an API that would be incorporated into the operating system and then would go away. And it doesn't specify a time range on that would go away, but it does claim that that's part of the plan. I guess the other thing I would say is that
I believe it says it will appear to go away.
Yeah. I guess the other thing I would say is that Apple, Google have expressed an unwillingness to make the app themselves. So they want to provide this API, but I think they don't want to actually create the interface for it. And I think that is partly to dodge some possible privacy accusations.
I think another thing to consider here is sort of who you trust less, which is, do you trust the federal government less, or do you trust Google and Apple less? You know, when it comes down to phone encryption, I can tell you who I trust more. I trust the FBI a lot less than I trust Apple. And I think that there's really good reason for that, right? We can look at, you know, the cases where the FBI has said, Apple, hand over this, and Apple says, no, we can't do that. We designed it to not be able to be that way. So I'm not saying that there won't be abuses by tech companies, because obviously there have been a lot of abuses by tech companies in the past. But I will say that their incentive structure is pretty different than incentive structure of countries. And that it's also pretty interesting because of the countries, you know, there's a lot of different countries out there, and they have a lot of different standards for what they're willing to do or not do. And it's interesting because right now, Google and Apple are in fact the gatekeepers to what's possible. Because they have sort of monopoly control over their app stores, they are able to determine who can use this and who can't. Another interesting fact on the technical side is that on Apple especially, but this is also kind of true in Android, you basically can't make a functional Bluetooth-based contact tracing app without some change in Apple's operating system. And this is part of why they're releasing a new API, is because this functionality was basically broken before that. In particular, there's something that makes it so that you can't run a sort of Bluetooth intensive activity in the background for an app. So you have to keep the app open all the time, which, as you guys know, is basically, you just don't do that with apps. You're not going to keep the app up and running in the foreground. So Apple and Google as well have the ability to sort of say who can do this and who can't, which is, it's much less true for things like GPS, but that is the case with Bluetooth. So I just want to note that they are a very interesting stakeholder here, because they have this weird gatekeeping monopoly power, which right now is actually for the better, because they're not allowing particular kinds of privacy invasive apps, but obviously could be a good thing or a bad thing.
Yeah, and I'll note, for example, the French government has been talking with Google and Apple and requesting that they release more, that they alter the spec to release more information. And that's sort of an ongoing conversation, but I think that sort of speaks to, again, who do you expect to overreach more?
All right. Okay. Next one up, we had a comment from Leslie.
Yeah, I was wondering what's the major underlying reason that we thought that most of the population would not trust a Bluetooth proximity profile based tracing, because, as Brad explained it, clearly I did take a look at the specification of the Stanford design, and it looks like it's bulletproof. So if it's implemented correctly and people do understand what it is, there is no reason not to trust it. Now, of course, 99% of the people are not going to review the protocol design, so there is an open issue. And so I was just I was just wondering that how that could be resolved, and I think it's a little bit similar to the problems that we had 25 years ago, that people didn't trust GPS sharing, and they still don't trust completely. They won't even expose their contact list in their cell phone. And today it's not that much of an issue if the contact list is on somewhere in the infrastructure. The other development that I would expect might happen, that once Apple and Google have it in their operating system, there are a lot of people who do want to have it there because there are all sorts of other applications, not mission critical, not pandemics. It's just finding their contacts that they are looking for real fast when they enter a conference or they enter a bar or a party. So and I think it's highly lucrative in terms of business growth, since data is the new gold. And so I'm not sure how it's going to play out in the market, in the mobile application market. I think that will be a major impact, and that will decide that how pervasive the use of it will be. But maybe Brad or some others have a different take on it.
Well, yeah, I want that app that reminds me what your name is.
Yeah, I guess I am hopeful that the sunset clause is implemented properly, and that some of those, OS level limitations come back, because I think, some of the, Bluetooth beacon based tracking and advertising is something I would at least like to be able to more carefully opt into than is possible when you're allowed to communicate in the background over Bluetooth all the time. But I guess I guess my hope is that those business opportunities go away.
Yeah, on a practical level, obviously we would want it to be removed from the operating systems as soon as the emergency is over. The problem is we have a hard time getting malicious bugs out of code years after we felt they should be removed. So I'm pretty sure there'll still be a lot of devices wandering around with the emergency mode still on, unless we took really dramatic measures.
Fair enough.
Yeah, they're having an interesting way of sort of implementing this so that they don't have to go through the cell phone carriers. So they're using, I think, Play Store services. This is Google, which is sort of something that sort of circumvents the carriers. So I do think that they will have the ability to sort of turn it on and off remotely, which is good and bad. In terms of the market, I think it's sort of a funny thing that has come up because I think people don't currently understand the problems with Bluetooth right now, which there are substantial problems right now with Bluetooth and privacy. If you have your Bluetooth on and you go to a store, many stores are already, the advertisers there are already going to be basically tagging your phone and using correlations from other data to try to figure out who you are. So this is a problem, and it's not new with these apps. It's just already a problem with the sort of current way Bluetooth is implemented and the current way companies are allowed to do this. So yes, absolutely, I think we should tackle that. I do think the current sort of changes aren't going to make this problem better. It's going to make this problem probably slightly worse. But I don't think that, I do think that that's sort of a thing we should try to tackle separately, especially at the legal level, because I think that it's an important question. I just treat it as somewhat separate because it's going to take a different approach to solve that problem, I think.
Right. Tessa, want to chime in, or shall we move to Jared? Okay, Jared, next question.
Yeah, hi. I want to say I found out about foresight in these salons through Peter Eckersley's talk, because I was looking for stuff on this. So thank you, Jeff and Tessa, both for sharing all this information. Maybe this question's a little out of left field, and I haven't dug deeply into this. This is kind of a side interest for me as far as research goes. But a lot of the technology-assisted solutions we've talked about, I think everyone has used some kind of location-based data, and I'm wondering, and maybe this discounts how difficult that interviewing really is, but has there been exploration of like chatbot interviews for contact tracing as a way of just kind of persistently asking people about their contacts and hoping, I mean, obviously it doesn't get rid of the memory fallibility aspect, but it's perhaps more scalable. sort of an Eliza for contact tracing, you know?
Yeah, yes.
Although I know people are working on sort of interview assistance apps, like Trevor Bedford's lab in Washington is working on that.
For training, right?
No,
or for the interviewers to use
for surveys. Yeah, so basically you can
Yeah.
send out someone a survey and they can basically
Gotcha.
fill it out, and then that can help contact tracers. I don't know if they've incorporated that into a bot type format, but
Yeah.
I think it wouldn't be that hard to take something that's like already an interview format and turn it into something that's a bot. Like,
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Surest way to get me to hang up the moment they call with a recorded voice.
Yeah, and I think that's right, Brad. I think there is something about like sort of the human touch that's really important here, and that it is not going to be easily automatable. So I think that these tools can help. I think these tools can really help. But at the same time, I do think that I really don't expect any technical solution to fully replace human contact tracers. I think you're just always going to need them, and that we should be thinking of these things as things that can work together and things that can supplement them, but not things that can replace them. And it drives me crazy when I read news articles about this, and they're like, digital contact tracing won't work because it won't fully replace human contact tracing. And I'm like, of course it won't. Like, no one's saying that it will. It's just, this is another tool we can use. And what we ultimately need to look for is the combination of these tools. And that's the only way it's going to work, so.
Yeah, I think it's basically, we should view this as something that makes our contact tracing more effective, not as contact tracing on its own.
All right, thanks. Korea next.
Hey, yeah, so I'm sorry if you guys already discussed this earlier, but this is kind of around the general putting the genie back into the bottle question. I just recently ran into something. I have a friend who's a former prosecutor who now works with at-risk youth, and like they're all over this. They want to know, oh, can we use contact tracing to figure out who our probation kids or our at-risk kids are hanging out with, and we can install stuff on their phones, and you know they can't turn it off. And so I'm just thinking that just like the authorities may mandate this in some degree or another, then pretty soon all the other authorities, you know, it's like once the public health authorities get this mandated, like every other person who thinks they're an authority is going to try and get this mandated, and pretty soon, you know, it could be always on. And if you've ever gotten a parking ticket, now they're going to be tracing your car all the time. So yeah, this is the standard question. What do you think about that?
Yeah, there's a lot of, or I don't know if a lot is the right phrase to use here. There's some political work being done on kind of this general notion of e-carceration, and you know, you put people on probation, and then you know, require them to wear a GPS anklet or something. And I think that work is really important, figuring out what is a safe and sustainable trade-off for that sort of thing. And I think you're probably right to worry that some of the infrastructure that gets built out for this, that is largely being built out in an open source fashion, could be repurposed for that.
I think it's important. Yeah, I agree with you, Tessa. And I think it's important that we sort of have lines drawn in the sand. This stuff gets complicated really fast, both technically and I think socially. So I think it's important that we sort of have clear defensible positions. And I think one of them is sort of the voluntary nature of sharing information. So I think that, you know, I think one of the key advantages of things like these Bluetooth-based contact tracing apps as they stand right now is that they are voluntary. Like, you can choose to use them or not use them. And I think it is really worth encouraging lots and lots of people to use them, and sort of getting the message out there that this thing is a thing that will really help. But I think, you know, keeping it voluntary is huge. And I think so long as we can get the messaging right and maintain public trust, people will just do this. And I think we're seeing this in a lot of parts of the world where there is high trust in government, that people are just totally willing to sort of do that. And I think that's like, I think the best privacy protection we have. There's an interesting case in in Czechia right now, where they are currently calling people and asking them if they would willingly share their telecom data, their GPS data, and things like that. And I sort of hear anecdotally that people are sharing that data, and that they won't collect it if people say no. Obviously, in Czechia, you know, that's Europe, it's a little different situation than the United States. But I think to me the like key selling point here is the information voluntary or is it not? I think it's worth defending that. Yeah.
Yeah, strong agreement on that. And I think this is also the reason why a lot of groups under, you know, the TCN coalition and the DPPPT and others are pushing for this fully decentralized model as well, where there's no useful information in the central database, and most of the computation is being, you know, not only is most of the data stored on your phone, but most of the computation is being done on your phone, such that, you know, a central authority that wanted to infer something from the database of positive test results wouldn't be able to infer very much. And I think I think it's also worth pushing for that kind of model.
Yeah, I wonder, like, you know, specifically in the example about probation, you know, currently, you know, you have the BOP that was supposed to release a bunch of prisoners to home confinement. Then, you know, like you had the General Barr memo, and it was like, even if they've served less than 50%, now they actually walked it back, and now they're back to 50%. So a lot of folks that were actually already waiting to be picked up and were in quarantine and like, you know, those self-isolating units, when their kind of like relatives actually arrived to pick them up, it was like, oh no, by the way, they're not going to be released after all. So like there was a lot of back and forth, and like one of the things that was mentioned a lot in the memo was, you know, you should release people to home confinement whether or not you can have ankle monitors on them or not. So this makes me think that was probably like a point of contention where the BOP was pushing back against the DOG, saying like, oh, we can't trace those people and we don't want to, you know, have the responsibility in case any of them are going to commit a crime again. So I'm thinking, you know, could something like that of like, you know, in kind of like increased testing actually be used as like kind of almost like more of an argument to get more people out in inhumane conditions. So, you know, I mean, I don't know, but you know, currently it doesn't really seem to go into that direction, but you know, you could make an argument that actually perhaps incentivizes the like release of more prisoners. I don't know, but all right. So one thing, we're at 7 p.m. right now. I would love to know if people want to get a hold of you, how can they? What are you working on right now? Can people kind of like support your project? What's up next for both of you?
Typing my email in the chat. Tessa, do you want to say it?
What a good idea. Yeah, you are welcome to email me at my silly email address. Yeah, I've been working on the COVID Watch project, which is one of a large constellation of apps trying to push this, you know, fully decentralized, privacy-preserving, fully voluntary approach to Bluetooth proximity tracing. If anyone is really hankering for an opportunity to work on that, you know, we need people both with organizational skills and with software development skills and with public health knowledge. So if you'd be excited to work on that kind of thing, please reach out to me. And then, yeah, the rest of my time is spent working on automation for biotechnology. So I guess if you want to chat about that sometime, you're also welcome to email me.
In terms of things I could use help with, there actually are a number of things. I could use more sort of volunteer researchers if people have, I don't know, anywhere more than like 5 hours per week that they'd be willing to sort of donate and they have some experience as sort of general research skills. I could really use help with sort of a variety of policy things I'm looking into, and a number of the people I work with could also use help. So that's an opportunity there. If people do have good connections to funding, I've also been looking at a lot of different projects, and some of them are currently limited by funding. I think COVID Watch is one of those. And so, you know, if people are looking for ways to contribute right now to COVID-19 response, I'd be happy to have a conversation and sort of give my take on where I think some of those bottlenecks are.
Very cool. Okay, great. We have your emails over there in the chat. That's great. Thank you, Jeff. Yeah, I'll be posting the video, I think, hopefully by tomorrow morning. And then tomorrow we have another salon. And that one will be, I think, from a representative from Galas PPE, who's going to talk about what they are still in need for, and that's mostly financial donations, but they're also going to kind of like talk a little bit about, you know, how people can still get involved, because masks are also still needed. And then we're going to have one more salon in the Sanity Preserver kind of like salon series, and then on Saturday we're going to open up like a new bucket of the workshops, and I'm going to share a link to those workshops. We just got the website up. It's still all under construction, but tomorrow I think we're going to have a Facebook event up. So if you're interested in kind of like really diving deeper into getting quite actionable and how, because for now we've taken 5 weeks basically to kind of like screen really good ideas and then the hope is that in the next 3 weeks we're actually going to get quite actionable. So if you're interested in kind of like getting your hands dirty virtually, then please join those. They will be at 11 a.m. every day instead of 9 or 6. And yeah, I'm going to post a little bit of information on those here in the chat. Please check them out. And yeah, you're welcome to come tomorrow again if you're interested. And until then, I hope you have a lovely evening. Thank you so much, Tessa and Jeff. It was really fantastic. I think learned a lot, and yeah, I would love to have you maybe back for an update once the US has kind of like gotten its together to actually figure out how much funding there may be and what kind of models they want to use. Okay, thank you so much. I hope you have a lovely evening. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks.
Bye.